Okay.
Hello, everyone. We're going to start in just 1 minute. Thank you, everyone. Thank you for joining us in our second family training webinar with our fabulous David Brown. This presentation will be approximately 60 to 70 minutes and will be followed by questions and discussion with family members. Everybody must select the language they wish to hear if you in the globe down below. So if you want to hear in English, press English, and Spanish, press Spanish, and also we have sign language interpretation. If you would like to ask a question or make a comment, you can post it in the chat and click the raise hand at the end, so we can answer your questions, or put it in the chat and someone will read it when it's time. To raise a hand, you also look at the bottom of your screen, and then there's the reactions, and there's the sign for raise hand. To speak when called upon during the discussion, please find your microphone. Otherwise, you have to mute your microphone during the presentation. And don't forget, after the presentation, there will be an evaluation survey provided at the end of the webinar that we would like very much for you to complete. Thank you, and I'll be introducing David Brown. David Brown is an internationally recognized deafblind educational specialist who has been working with children with multisensory impairments since 1983. In the United Kingdom, he was the head of the Family and Children's Services for SENS, the National Deafblind Association. Then he moved to San Francisco, California in 2000 to work with California Deafblind Services for 15 years, and he continued to live and work there as a freelance consultant since his retirement 7 years ago. He has given presentations about various aspects of his deafblindness in 14 different countries and in 31 states in the US. And his articles about deafblindness have been translated into at least 14 different languages. David has a credential in education of students with multisensory impairments from the University of Birmingham in England, and an honorary doctorate of science from the Central Michigan University for research work with children with deafblindness. In 2005, David was given the Star in Charge Award by the Charge Syndrome Foundation, and in 2013, he was awarded the Deafblind International Lifetime Achievement Award for innovative and visionary work with people with deafblindness. We value his continued support to CDBS and the families and professionals we serve. So here is David Brown, the one and only, and take it on, David. I mean, this is your floor now.
Thank you, Myrna. I'll just press share screen. Now you can see it. Okay, yes. Thank you, Myrna. Hello.
My screen.
Hello, everyone. As you see, I'm remarkably low tech, partly as a function of my age and mostly as a function of me. I'm thrilled to be back with California Deafblind Services just for 90 minutes. I loved my 15 years working with them. And since I retired 7 years ago, I have missed the passion and the sense of fellowship that we share in our little team. Thank you to Myrna for introducing me. I always worry a bit about those biographies because they make you sound like some kind of genius or megastar, which is not how I see me or anyone else, actually. Right at the beginning, I want to give you my email address, welshgold@gmail.com, because this is a huge topic and I've had great difficulty trying to decide what to include and especially what to exclude from my presentation. And if anything isn't clear to you, or if anything particularly interests you in what I say, you can always email me for further information, or you might want some links or some articles or whatever. And I'm very up for that. As I said, it's a big topic, and I'm using a tech system on my Apple Mac called Presenter Tools. So the big slide on the left of the screen is the one I'm talking to. On the right, you can see a smaller slide, which is the next one coming up. And at some point, I've got far too many slides. At some point, I'll be skipping forwards and missing out slides. So I hope you're not too distracted by the small screen on the right. Okay, I haven't done anything like this for over 6 months, so I'm feeling very rusty and low tech. I want to begin with 4 propositions that I really like to start with. First of all, that deafblindness includes the most complex conditions that we know, and the unique combination of true multisensory impairment with multiple other anomalies, some of them potentially life-threatening, can lead to extreme variability in functioning and periods when the child may be unavailable for attending and learning. And they can be unavailable for a whole range of reasons. They may be in the room with you physically, but that doesn't mean that their brain and their sensory perception abilities are available for taking in information. The next proposition, the right educational program for each child with deafblindness never already exists, but must be created. The program must be fitted to the child, not the child to the program. And I know this often causes problems for families when a child first enters school or when they transfer to a different school or even a different classroom. There's always a desire to get the child to fit in with what people are already doing and already offering, but that rarely works with this population. My third proposition, that a successful and appropriate educational program begins and depends upon skilled assessment, which is flexible, ongoing, and sensitive. Every child with deafblindness can be assessed successfully, provided the people doing the assessment know what they are doing. And this, of course, is at the root of all the problems that we face in getting children educated effectively. The ability to assess them effectively is a rare skill, which is why agencies like California Deafblind Services exist and why they are so important and so valuable. And my fourth proposition relates to number 3. Anyone responsible for designing and delivering a child's educational program needs some familiarity with deafblindness, which is kept up to date. With the increasing amount of information about deafblindness now available on the internet, this is perfectly feasible. And I go back 30 years, 25 years, when it was difficult for anyone to find information about deafblindness. But now with the internet, there is a wealth of information out there, and you may need somebody to direct you to the most relevant, useful information, but there's no excuse for not knowing about deafblindness or not knowing about the specific condition or syndrome that an individual student has as their diagnosis. And a reminder that classic deafblind educational approaches really are a series of imperatives. You could almost shout these at people who are meant to be educating the child. Follow the child, know the child, individualize, do with, not for, create conversations, and use a multi-sensory perspective, both for your assessment and for your teaching. Now, to go on to availability for learning, this is a slide I made some time ago, and as I go down these bullet points, you'll start to get an idea of what a huge, complex topic this is. And all I'm going to do in the next 50 to 55 minutes is touch on some of the things that I think are very important. And the main one is the top of the list, arousal level or biobehavioral state. And I will talk about that in a little more detail in a moment. That relates very much to the next one, which is self-regulation and self-stimulation. And I'm hoping to talk about both those in a little bit of detail as well. The child's availability for learning also depends on a host of factors, many, many factors. Some of them are internal to the child and some of them are external in the environment around the child. And the internal factors include medical issues like their state of health, their energy levels, whether they're experiencing pain or not, whether their nutrition levels are good or whether they are losing out on nutrition, possibly because of feeding issues or because of severe ill health, and what kind of medications they're on. And they may be on all kinds of medication for all sorts of reasons. And sadly, many of the medications that children are on to help control behavior have the effect of making the children's minds less available for learning. So it's a constant tightrope walk between getting the child's medication to a level where it's getting their behavior under control if there are behavioral issues, but not to such an extent that it's making them too drowsy or too distracted to be available for learning and learning effectively. And the other internal factor, the key internal factors, of course, relate to the sensory status of the child. What visual perception do they have? What hearing perception do they have? How well do their other sensory systems function or not function because of impairment? And remembering that each of our senses depends on all the other senses to function effectively. If I had more time, I'd talk about these things in a lot more detail. I'm a big talker, and by nature, I'm a synthesizer. Whatever topic I'm talking about, I see connections all the time, which take me off on tangents. So I'm going to have to use big self-discipline today, which I will probably fail to do, to finish on schedule. I will finish on schedule, but I probably won't get through all of the slideshow. And then other issues internal to the child: what level of motivation do they have? And what kind of things are meaningful to the child based on two things in particular: their previous experience and also their level of sociability, how well they relate to people, if they're interested in people, or if they dislike people, if they have a relationship with the people trying to teach them, or if that relationship hasn't really developed or hasn't developed in a positive way to encourage the child to make themselves available for learning. Then there's the whole complex issue of communication. And communication is much more than language. Of course, language is an important component, but communication is much broader than language. What is the current range of the child's expressive behaviors? In other words, how well can they indicate how they're feeling, what they like, what they want, what they're thinking about? And then the huge topic, which is of special interest to me, assessment. And I will try and say a little bit about that today, but as I say, time is limited. And for me, the main goal of assessment with a child is to help me understand them and understand who they are better than I do before the assessment, so that I can then let the child know that they are understood. And I think people often forget the power of feeling that you are understood, feeling that the person with you knows you, cares about you, and is reading you in some way, whether you use expressive language or not. They're reading you in some way so that they clearly understand where you are and what you're thinking and what you want. And then all this, of course, depends on time available and the way you pace interactions and activities. And in most cases, the children are likely to need more time and slower pacing, but every so often I meet a child who actually needs things much quicker, kind of boom, 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 boom. If you're too slow, you lose them. So it, like everything, it's much more complicated than just a simple black or white issue or a simple this way or that way issue. Somebody in the field who's working on availability for learning is Chris Russell. Chris Russell is a teacher of the visually impaired, and he also works on the New York State Deafblind Project. And he's written a very interesting article in the Visual Impairment and Deafblind Education Quarterly, which I would recommend. He also has contributed to a website which is called Paths to Literacy. And the website is here, but if you're interested, you can email me and I can give you the link. Paths to Literacy is a very useful website. It covers a huge range of topics, and Chris is one of the contributors. And I rather like this little definition he uses at the beginning of his section. He says, availability for learning refers to the time when an individual is paying attention and is able to listen and respond. Many children with sensory impairments have medical and health challenges such as seizure disorders, sensory challenges, and central nervous system differences. These factors often make self-regulation particularly difficult. A biobehavioral state is a state of arousal. And I never use the word biobehavioral because I think it's far too technical a term for most people to have in their familiar vocabulary. It's the correct technical term, but I like to talk about state of arousal because I think people are more likely to get the hang of what it is I'm talking about. And I see in the chat box, you have a link to Chris Russell's article, and you also have a link to the Paths to Literacy website. Thank you. I don't know if that's Julie or Myrna or who is doing that, probably Brian. And also the webpage for what I'm talking about. While I'm talking about resources, along with Chris Russell, on the Perkins School for the Blind website, and the link is to Perkins e-learning, there are two very nice webcasts from Jan van Dijk, who was the great guru in our field. One is about child-guided assessment. The other one, which I particularly love, is on the role of the emotional brain. And they have the big advantage of being little videos rather than written information. And if you're like me, it's much easier to watch a 15-minute video than to read a 6-page article. So I would recommend those. And then on the California Deafblind Services website, two articles that came out almost at the same time. One from me called "What Does Follow the Child Mean?" and one from no less than Julie Meyer, which is called "Capacity or Deficit, the lens we use to view students does make a difference." And Julie's talking about positive assessment approaches, and I'm giving ideas on how to do positive assessment by observing the child and what to observe for. And then the last link I'll give you, I think in this presentation, is popularly known as OHOA, O-H-O-A, and those initials stand for Open Hands, Open Access. The link is here, and this is an introduction. This link gives you an introduction to this training program. It's a huge collection of training modules that were devised specifically to help interveners, the one-on-one staff who are allocated to a specific student with deafblindness, to help train them on the broadest possible front for the job that they're doing. But the modules are freely available, and they're so good that all sorts of people are now accessing them, people like me, for example, not just interveners. And they are quite phenomenal. You can go there and get lost. It's like anything on the internet, or it's like YouTube. You go to one specific thing and you suddenly realize it's 2 hours later and you should have gone to bed an hour ago. So I would recommend them. When I talk about observational assessment, for many years, I've been talking about these questions. When I first meet a child, I have these questions in mind. They are the 4 key things that I want to discover about a child so that I can work on an effective educational assessment. First of all, how do you feel? What do you like? What do you want? And what do you do? And normally I focus on the last one in detail, but today I'm focusing on the first one, because how do you feel? That question actually means, what is your biobehavioral state at the moment? And rather than what is this child's biobehavioral state, I'm thinking, is this child stressed and anxious? Is this child tired? Is this child highly distractible? Is this child self-stimulating like crazy in order to block access from people like me and the outside world? Is this child starting to get over-aroused and maybe really, really terribly upset and anxious? Or are they getting drowsier and drowsier, and are we going to lose them soon if we don't take a break, or if we don't do something else to lift their arousal level? So I think how someone's feeling gives you quite a good insight into what we mean by biobehavioral state. And I'm very much today talking about arousal and or biobehavioral state and the importance of assessment. Now, when I talk about biobehavioral states, I often use this list. You can find many different versions of this list on the internet. I like this one because it has 9 levels of arousal. And I think of it as a ladder. And at the top, you've got the highest level of arousal, which is uncontrollable agitation. And at the bottom, you've got the lowest level of arousal, which is deep sleep. And we are all on that ladder. We all go up and down the ladder for all sorts of reasons. Just like the children we're talking about, we go up and down the ladder, sometimes for internal reasons, because we're tired, because we're hungry, because we're getting angry, because we have stomachache, or we have a headache, or a tooth is hurting, or because we've just remembered something very important we should have done this morning that we forgot to do. All those things will move us up and down the ladder, very often up the ladder, but sometimes down the ladder. But then there are the external things, like we move up and down the ladder because the environment is getting very noisy, or the lighting is too bright, or there are too many people milling around, or we're with someone who always makes us bored, or who always makes us angry. And all those things are going to have an impact on our arousal level. If you think of it like a ladder, think of going up the ladder and down the ladder. If I ask you at the moment, if you were in the room with me, where are you on this ladder at the moment? I'm assuming most of you would be on the active awake or the quiet awake step of the ladder. And for most people, that is the best place to be in order to be available for learning. If you're following this webinar, and if you're really trying to listen and understand and learn, you probably should be either actively awake or quietly awake. If it's at the end of a busy working day and you'd much rather be cooking and eating your dinner at this point, you may be dropping down to drowsy. Some of you by the end of this session may have dropped down to active sleep. There are people who are more available to learning if they are higher on the ladder. And I know children, and I also know some adults who don't have deaf blindness, who learn best when they're somewhere between active awake and fussy awake. They need to be in a pretty high level of arousal in order to attend and take in information. So those things can be very personal. The big difference between us and children with deaf blindness or multisensory impairment is that we can learn about this ladder, and we're quite good, most of us, at knowing where we are on the ladder and if we're not in a good place for learning. I was feeling particularly tired today because we had a complicated night with one of our dogs. And I realized at just before 4 that I needed to make some coffee. I never drink coffee after breakfast, but I needed a cup of coffee because that was going to bring my arousal level up. When I couldn't get my slideshow open at the beginning of this session, suddenly it turned out I hadn't needed the coffee because my arousal level went from active awake to fussy awake to mild agitation. And as Julie joked, that's got your arousal level up, and it certainly did. So we know if we're getting over-aroused or under-aroused and drowsy. We also know what to do about it to bring ourselves back into a better place. So if we're starting to get agitated and we're going up to fussy awake, we need to deal with it. And we might do some deep breathing. We might do some stretching. We might actually do some movement. We might start bouncing our feet and our knees up and down. We might do some hand clenching. We might pull our fingers and make our knuckles crack. We might get up and leave and go and take a breather, go outside in the yard and take a little breather. We may have a cigarette. It depends on the individual. If we're going down the ladder and we need to wake ourselves up, we may also get up and move. We may do some hand flapping or knuckle pulling. We might do some hand wringing. We might do some shoulder movement. All those kinds of things that we know move us up and down the ladder. So really, biobehavioral state, although it's complicated, is something that applies to all of us. And it's something we learn as we reach adulthood, how to deal with. Some people better than others. I have 3 brothers. 2 of them self-regulate very well, like I do. One of them has never been very good at self-regulation. And he tends to drop down the ladder, or especially shoot up the ladder, out of his own control. And he often needs somebody else to remind him that that's happening. As Chris Russell said, dealing with these issues is difficult for most children, especially young children, but also often teenagers and adults with deaf blindness. we should be aiming at some point to work with the student on these questions. Where are they on the ladder of arousal? And how can we tell where they are? And is there some way they can tell us, or they can understand what we're telling them? Where do they need to be at this time, either because it's bedtime and they should be going to sleep, or because they're in the classroom and they shouldn't be getting drowsy, or they shouldn't be jumping up and down and trying to, run out of the room? And how can they get there? How can they calm down, in other words, or how can they wake up? And in the beginning, we can work on that with the child, but at some point we should be seeing that as part of our educational program, is to work on the child's understanding of these things. The ladder that I showed you is one that I like, but I've seen people adapting that kind of ladder, using fewer steps instead of 9 steps, using a different kind of vocabulary, because the vocabulary I showed you is quite technical when we talk about arousal levels. We can mark each step with a label using words, or we could use symbols, we could use pictures, we could use happy faces and sleepy faces and angry, shouting faces. We could use Braille. I mean, there are all kinds of options. We could also, with the child, revisit situations where poor self-regulation caused a problem, particularly where the child perhaps had a meltdown. And I think when children reach a certain level of communicative ability, social stories can be a really useful way of doing that. So you're not asking the child why they had a meltdown, but you're telling a story of a student who had a meltdown and what happened when they had the meltdown and the reasons why it might have happened. Some children respond very well to role play as part of that process. And a big part of it is, what did the child like, or what did they need, or what did they dislike, and what did they not need or not want in the situation that you're revisiting. A nice definition of self-regulation comes from a neuropsychologist, and his work has really helped me a lot. And with help from him, I've come up with these questions. Can we help the individual student to recognize and deal with excessive levels of over-arousal or under-arousal in socially acceptable ways? If self-regulation is difficult, can the student learn ways of asking for help? And this is possible, though it may take a long time. But I have known children at the age of 6 or 7 who've been able to develop the ability to know that they're getting too over-aroused or too under-aroused, and they may need to let somebody know in some way. And the jobs for us, first of all, reading the child effectively. All the time we need to be observing and interpreting what we observe. And I think that's a skill that sometimes gets overlooked in educational programming, and specifically in day-to-day teaching, to constantly be observing the student to understand what arousal level they're at, and whether their arousal level is stable or whether it's moving, and whether it's moving up the ladder or down the ladder, making connections as to why they may be going up the ladder or coming down the ladder, and learning what can help get them back in a better place to be available for learning, helping them to feel their bodies effectively. And I'll say more about feeling the body in a moment, providing an increasingly precise vocabulary of emotions or emotional states, rather than saying over-aroused or under-aroused, it's probably better with children to use vocabulary relating to emotional states like excited or upset or worried or angry or sleepy or tired or bored, that kind of vocabulary. We need to be thinking about directing the students' attention to how they are feeling and how we can tell, reminding them of strategies like, do you need your couche ball now to calm you down? I've known a number of children who like to hold a couche ball and spin it around in the other palm of their hand. And they find this quite a satisfying input for calming down. Or do they need to go and do a little walk or do some jumping or whatever? And it's good to think about matching and sharing experiences and feelings. And part of the role play and part of social stories is to help children understand that we all self-regulate and we all have issues with self-regulation and we all have to deal with it. And this is a picture from a family in England. I did a webinar and a mother in England who I've never met sent me this. It's like a weather chart, really. And you've got sunshine at the top and thunder and lightning at the bottom. But they've turned it into, if you like, a ladder of arousal. And at the top, you've got happy, and then it goes down to calm, quiet. And at the bottom, you've got cross, which is an English term meaning angry. And they've got that black arrow on a string, and that arrow can be moved up and down. And that's a design idea that I saw once in a school in Texas many years ago. And I've seen a whole variety of interesting adaptations of this idea where the child themselves can move the arrow to indicate. I've seen particularly successful ones using smiley faces and shouting faces and angry faces, where the child can move the arrow. And someone said to me once, but mightn't the child then just use that to manipulate you? And I said, well, that would be good if they understand the concept that they can use it to manipulate you. You know they're understanding the concept, which is what we're after. Then you've got to deal with, what do we do with a child who isn't being honest with their emotions chart, but is actually using it to fool around with you, or to get more movement, or to get more bouncing, or to get a little break from the activity. And as someone says, Julie says, I love the way it's tied to the weather. And I rather like that. I'd never seen one developed from a weather chart before. This is the neuropsychologist I mentioned is Jude Nicholas, who lives and works in Norway. And he wrote this a long time ago, but I really like it. He said, self-regulation is defined as the capacity to manage one's thoughts, feelings, and actions in adaptive and flexible ways across a range of contexts. So across a range of contexts, wherever you are, whatever you're doing, you do need to be able to self-regulate. And he talks about managing three things: your thoughts, your feelings, and your actions. And I rather like that trio of things you're working on. So to get your thinking under control rather than switching off or getting crazy and hysterical and paranoid, your feelings, so that your emotions stay within an acceptable range for the context you're in, and then your actions, what the outcome is of those thoughts and feelings in terms of the things you do. A lot of our ability to know where we are on that ladder comes from the way our brain feels our body. We start to know we're drowsy because we feel our bodies slumping. We feel our heads curling forwards. We tend naturally to go into flexion as we go down the ladder. We feel our muscle tone getting looser and looser as the muscle tone goes down. And our breathing might get slower and deeper, but particularly slower. If we're going up the ladder, if you think in terms of getting stressed or getting angry, our muscle tone increases, our body temperature increases, our breathing usually gets more rapid and more shallow, and we often do things like clenching our fists, clenching our teeth, and our shoulders come up. And if we're in that state for too long, we may even start to develop a headache because we store that stress or anger often in the shoulders and the back of the head, but also in the butt and the lower back. I believe that because of their multisensory impairments, most children with deafblindness don't feel their bodies very effectively. It's only our senses that connect our brain to our bodies. So if we know what's happening to our bodies and how our bodies are feeling, that's because that information has come to our brain through our sensory systems. If those sensory systems are missing or they're impaired in some way, that information isn't coming through in a complete way. It may be missing, it may be partially there, it may be rather confused, or it may be coming through with a long latency. It may be taking an unusual amount of time. And we know children who, for various reasons, need an object in front of them for a long time before their brain actually sees it. We also know children who may need a sound followed by an extensive period of time before their brains are able to perceive it and they're able to respond in some way with eye movement or a jump or turning to look for the source of the sound. And I talk about communication in a broad sense as, first of all, communication with your own body. We all need to have our brain in good contact with our body. If part of our body goes to sleep, if we sit on the couch too long, sitting on one leg, we talk about the leg going to sleep. And it's quite a disturbing feeling, particularly if we need to move. And we go to great lengths to increase the blood circulation back to the tactile and proprioceptive receptors in the leg so that our brain can feel it again. So we need to be aware that we might need to do some exercises with a child before every interaction in order to get their brains in better communication with their bodies. Once that's reasonably okay, or as good as we can get it, then the child is more likely to be available for making contact and being available to communicate with the immediate environment around them. And then the long-term goal of our educational program is to help them be available and communicate with the wider world, both the social world and the physical world. And I see in the chat box, Amanda has shared with us, Amanda McKee has shared a screenshot. She says, this is a visual I created to help my child's educational team think about his regulation and his readiness to learn. And I won't open it for myself, Amanda, because I might lose Zoom, but I will certainly look at it later. And yes, Julie's saying I'll probably add it to my collection. Oh, and it's Winnie the Pooh. Oh, well, I'm a huge fan. When people on Facebook say, what's the earliest memory you have of a major world event? My earliest memory is when A.A. Milne, who was the man who created Winnie the Pooh, when he died in 1956. I was 7 years old and we had a special lesson in school about him, and we all drew a picture of him, and I drew a picture of his funeral. And I remember the teacher was quite disturbed, but it was okay. I turned out to be okay in the end. Anyway, that's an aside. Let's think about self-stimulation a bit. I'm a big fan of self-stimulation. So think about the constancy of sensory feedback, that our sensory systems are picking up sensory stimulation and sending the information to our brains all the time. Self-stimulation is any sensory input we seek, which is not directly the result or necessary for a specific activity. It's any sensory input through any channel that we seek, which facilitates our functioning. Why do we self-stimulate? Well, because the senses connect the brain to the body. Self-stimulation improves the connection between the brain and the body. Sensory inputs have a very powerful, significant, and direct impact on our arousal levels. Sensory inputs can move us up and down that ladder very powerfully. Some senses may be more important to us than others at certain times. And this is a list I made. You could probably add to it. We all self-stimulate to maintain alertness, to wake up, to calm down, to maintain postural control, to feel our bodies, to keep comfortable or to get comfortable, to occupy our minds, to self-regulate, to fight boredom, to maintain attention, to keep sane, and generally to improve our functioning to achieve our goals. For various reasons, children with deafblindness may have poor social awareness, so self-stimulation behaviors may be more extreme and more obvious, but attempts to stifle and stop self-stimulation behaviors may result in worse self-regulation and generally less good functioning. And observing how and when a child self-stimulates can offer invaluable insights into who they are and how they work for our assessment, our teaching, our behavior management, and our relationship building, letting the child know they're being understood. And a last slide on self-stimulation. If the behavior isn't dangerous or illegal, ask what does it mean and intervene to try and answer that question, not in the first instance to stop the behavior as the primary aim. Now, you're probably all thinking, what if the child's self-stimulation is dangerous? What if they're hurting themselves or hurting other people? What if they are biting themselves or gouging their skin or banging their head and things like that? Well, as I say, if it isn't dangerous or illegal, I would spend some time observing it, talking to others to work out why they're doing it, what are they getting from it, and why do we think they're doing it? Is it for internal reasons, or is it because of the environment and the people around them? If it is dangerous or illegal, obviously we need to intervene urgently, and that can be very challenging. I'm not really talking today about challenging behavior, but it can be very difficult to deal with. And that's where people often turn to medication. And sometimes medication can be the best option, but sometimes I think people go to medication a little too quickly. And it can be a very long process of exploring medication to try and get the best outcome. So I won't say any more there, but now I'm going to show you some pictures of children self-stimulating to self-regulate. Here's someone flat on her back on the floor. She's brought one ankle up on the other knee. So she's really telling her brain that her body is completely stable and fixed. She's not going to fall over. And then she's free to use her vision without worrying about falling, without worrying about postural control, without worrying about postural instability, which is part of the condition. She has charge syndrome, so she has poor vestibular function and low muscle tone, but she wants to use her vision. And the best way she can do that is at this moment, at this age, is in this position. Now, it would be very easy to go over because of her age and say, come on, sit up properly, sit on a chair, put the book on the desk, look down at the book. But at this age and at this stage of development, all those things would make it much, much more challenging for the child to use vision in a consistent, reliable way. And we would actually be making them less available for learning by insisting that they get into a position that is stereotypically seen as the correct behavior in a classroom. Now, we are working towards children possibly sitting on chairs at tables, but that might not be the best thing to be forcing on the child at the moment. Here is a boy chewing on a kerchief. The kerchief is there specifically for him to bite on, and firm biting or clenching the jaw is a major way of calming. It also confirms for the brain where the head is and what the head is doing and whether the head is moving or not. But I think it's particularly important as a way of bringing arousal levels down. And many of us are familiar with children who wear something around their neck, like a kerchief, or maybe a silicone chewy thing. And at times of high arousal, if the child doesn't put it in their mouth to bite on themselves, people will come over and suggest to the child that they should put it in their mouth and clench on it in order to bring their arousal level down. Here is a young lady, one of my favorite pictures. This is a girl who's now, it's an old picture. She has significant orthopedic issues and health issues. She's been in a busy classroom all day. She's come home and all by herself, she has got herself into this extremely, to me, challenging position as a way of chilling out and tuning into home after a really busy, potentially stressful day in school. Now, if I needed to calm down and chill out, the last thing I would do is put my shoulders on a couch and my heels on an armchair and suspend myself in space. Apart from anything else, I would damage my back. I would also fall down very quickly. We've got to get away from stereotypical thinking about, looking at children and saying, that's crazy. She should be lying on the floor, or she should be doing deep breathing. She will do what works most effectively for her in order to chill out and bring that arousal level down. Or if she's very tired at the moment, bring that arousal level up. Here's a young lady. If you look carefully, she's got a tablet on the arm of the couch. She's got the side of her head resting on it, and she's using her hand to operate the screen. And she is looking, if you enlarge this picture, she's looking with peripheral side vision at the screen. And I say, this is normal viewing posture when you have no vestibular sense, central visual field loss, poor touch and proprioceptive perception, breathing difficulties, and low muscle tone. Again, to insist that this girl sits up straight, to insist that she puts the tablet in front of her and looks directly at it would be entirely counterproductive. One day we would like her to be sitting up. We would like her muscle tone to increase. We would like much better postural control. We would like her possibly to have better head control so that she can use the visual field that she has more effectively. But at the moment, this works. And that one of the important things to say is children are surprisingly good at knowing what works for them. We have to remember they may be, conventionally described as handicapped or disabled. What that doesn't mean is that they're stupid. And yes, what works for them might be dangerous or illegal, and we may need to intervene, but it also might be powerfully functional for them at that moment in that context. Here is a teenager I met about 7 years ago. She was born very prematurely and had a brain hemorrhage. She is doing an orientation and mobility session around the school campus using the white cane, and it's break time. She's getting tired. I've observed her feet. Instead of stepping, her feet are sliding along the floor. Instead of being upright, her head is down and she's flexing forwards. And instead of tapping the cane side to side, she's leaning on it and it's starting to bend. They get to this swing, which is one of her break stations, and they tell her she can go on the swing. She gets in this very complicated position. Again, this is the last thing I would do for a break, but it works for her. Apparently, she always gets in exactly the same position, and then she rocks her body very slightly to get some movement. She does it for a couple of minutes, and then they come and tell her to get up and come back. They give her the cane, and now instead of sliding her feet, she's stepping. Instead of being with her head slumped forward, her head is erect, and the cane is no longer being leaned on, but is tapping. In other words, this little session on the swing has helped her to reorganize all her systems to get her arousal level in a much better place to be attending to the activity of learning to move using the cane. And here's a young man in England giving himself some intense pressure by squeezing into this narrow gap on the TV table. That deep pressure is also helping him to move on the ladder of arousal, actually to calm down. Deep pressure tends to be very calming. This young lady is giving herself deep pressure in a variety of ways on parts of her body. This young man is getting it with compression between the shelves. I'm going to fast forward because I have 6 minutes left. I don't know how many people watching today have a child with Charge syndrome or maybe work with a child with Charge syndrome. But I gave some thinking recently to fatigue in charge about two or 3 years ago. People often complain about children with deafblindness being lazy. You hear it often with children with Charge syndrome, but also across the population. Every one of these 21 issues could cause a person to get excessively tired quite quickly or quite often. Children with Charge sometimes have as many as 19 or 20 of these issues. Think about that. Many of children in our population probably have half a dozen or more of these issues. That has big implications for their energy levels and the extent to which they can stay concentrated and stay paying attention and being available for learning. So we really need to get away from the L word, the dreaded L word, lazy, and think about, more realistically, think about what the students are having to deal with. I'm going to go right to the end now, and bear with me while I skip through. I was going to say all sorts of things, but you will have a copy of the slideshow. I will send this slideshow to Myrna and Julie because the one I sent them the other day is quite a bit different to the one I've actually used. I just want to say a little bit about the environment because I haven't done that very much, but we know that sensory inputs are very powerful, and we know that we may need to do a lot of work to modify and adapt the environment to make it right for the child. And the people in the child's environment, they may need to be limited in number. they may need to be very available, and they may need to be working in very routine, predictable ways. I've already mentioned the importance of thinking about time and pacing, and also the space around the child, the physical environment. I've done technical assistance visits where I've been able to improve the child's availability by very simple changes to the physical environment. A little girl who was sitting at a round table, there were several round tables in the room. She was at a table, and the only walkway through the tables happened to be right behind her chair. So all morning, she had people walking behind her. Sometimes their clothing would touch her, and there were air currents and also noise, of course, moving behind her. She was very, very distractible. I suggested after break time that they sit her on the other side of the table with her back towards the wall, and that the girl's attention span improved dramatically simply by changing the part of the room she was in. I also helped get a boy more attentive by getting him moved away from the large heating unit, which tended to make a low rumbling noise. And it was working all through the school day. And I asked if we could move him away because he was wearing hearing aids and he was right next to the heating unit. So those adaptations are important. And if you go to paths to literacy, but especially if you go to open hands, open access, you will find masses of information about adapting routines, adapting the physical environment to support the child's availability. And let me think. Yeah. Why is this important? The things I've talked about, why are they so important? First of all, we need to understand the child's challenges. We need to get realistic, and our assessment should have that as a goal. We need to gain a more accurate idea of their needs, but we also need to appreciate better the child's adaptive behaviors. The children are discovering their own adaptive behaviors all the time, and they're often not seen and not appreciated. And we need to be able to introduce the essential child to other people. We need to get to know them so we can tell other people who they are and how they function. Somebody said, did I say technical assistance visits? That was in the days when I worked with California Deafblind Services, and they still do technical assistance, but you'd need to go to their website or talk to Myrna or Julie or the rest of the team because there are particular systems for doing that. And I see Julie's given you the information. And Amanda McKee says, how do you balance recognizing and respecting the child's need or desire for sensory activities with a child who never seems to get their fill? Yes, the children who never seem to get their fill, sometimes you have to put your heads together and come up with more powerful ways of administering sensory input. Sometimes you may need to target the sensory inputs that you're giving them and see if that helps with the problem. And sometimes you may need to get rather heavy-handed and a bit more like a school mom in order to break through that drive for constant self-stimulation. Sometimes it's possible to get through the self-stimulation and still teach the child alongside the self-stimulation. I mean, there's a great variety, but one of the most common things I was asked for in my career, especially when I went into schools, was how can we stop this child self-stimulating? And the first thing I would think is we need to talk a lot about self-stimulation because we don't want to stop self-stimulation, but we do want to make the self-stimulation more targeted and more useful, rather than something that takes the child away. And it's important to make us aware of the fundamentally important things which often get overlooked or forgotten. It's important to remember that everything the child does probably takes more time, more planning, more energy, more concentration, and more attention than it does for other children who do not have the same array of problems. And it's to help people understand that things that look crazy might actually be functional, clever adaptations specific to that individual student. And those things are really important. If anything comes out of this talk today, I hope it's the importance of really respecting the student. That isn't just paying lip service to doing the right thing. You have to do a lot of work in order to be able to truly respect a child effectively. And I'd like—
Sure, David, I'm sorry to interrupt.
Okay.
Didn't mean to, but we only have like 17 more minutes, and I'm sure that's a lot of information to take in, and I'm sure we're going to be remember this, but I would like to give the opportunities for questions, if you don't mind.
No, that's fine.
Yeah, so whomever would like to ask a question for David, this is your time. So you can open up your mic and speak up. Even if it's in Spanish, we have the interpreter that will interpret in English. So please.
I see in the chat a message from Linda, who I actually know and have known for a long time. Hello, Linda. And of course, the people who made this possible today are the people at California Deafblind Services. And I'm very proud to say 2 of the members of staff were people I've known, are people I've known a long time, because they were teachers who attended our deafblind training program at San Francisco State.
Yes.
And it's really exciting to see them now working in the field.
Yes, very, very much. Okay, yeah, we see something for Linda that says thank you for the presentation. And I know there's a message for a question from Alma in Spanish. I don't see it. Yes, Alma. Maria, would you like to read it? English and Spanish?
It came in at 5:58, yeah.
Yes, yes.
Yeah.
Okay. Do you want me to read it in Spanish? Okay. Okay, go ahead.
Okay. I think it's, if you're not familiar with observing children and looking at their sensory stimulation, it isn't a particularly easy thing to develop. It took me many years, but I think the thing to do is to bring other people in, to talk to other people. I know it's difficult that the people who should be the specialists are occupational therapists. It's not easy to get occupational therapists anywhere, including in California, but they're the people with the most direct training in these things. But other people to use would be deafblind teachers, people like the staff at California Deafblind Services, and people who can help you direct you to information so that you can analyze, like if she's bouncing up and down, she's probably giving herself a lot of vestibular input. If you think of all the different senses, if she's sucking on her fingers, she's giving herself a lot of tactile input, but she might be sucking on her fingers to help her brain find out where her head is. And the sucking on the fingers is often a way of calming down. So it is complicated, and any parent can try and work this out for themselves, but it's almost always a lot easier if you can bring someone else in to help you with it. And that might mean getting them in directly with your daughter, or it might be making a video of her and sending it to people. That isn't as effective, but it's better than nothing.
Thank you, David. And Linda has a question. Linda, you wanna open? I think your microphone is off. I think you're muted.
Yeah, she's muted.
Yes.
Okay.
Okay. So hi everyone. Hi David. Nice to see you again,
Hi,
David.
you too.
Yeah, and everyone, thank you for prepare this for us like a families. Like you know, I was waiting for this presentation long time ago, and I was asking myself how to deal with my son Michael on this big you know, list of disabilities. You know, he's drowsy all the time. He can sleep. He has a lot of acid reflux because I don't know, due to a lot of medication, the epilepsy never controlled. Has like 5 seizures. Now he's having like 2, like kind of the median grand mal, and it's very very tough, you know, to be dealing with Michael and how to work with him, how to find out the best way to work with him. So I have been learning by California Deafblind Services, but it's still pretty hard. And Michael is severely handicapped with the cerebral palsy, and if he's blind, he's deaf, and the multiple disabilities that is hard to how to maneuver the hand. I don't know, he's 32 years old already. And I feel, you know, like trying different things and not too much connection with him. So I'm feel like sad with myself and with him because I can reach, you know, the best way to have this communication with him. So, and this is a spectacular presentation, David. So thank you. I learned, but I feel like it's still like I'm not pretty reaching my dream with Michael. So it's hard.
And I know Michael, of course. I haven't seen him for a long time.
I know.
And I think you make a good point. There's a danger if you do a presentation like this for 1 hour, people might think it's quite easy. And especially they might think it's easy for me, but hard for you. It's hard for me as well. And it can take a long time. And the best approach is what we call trial and error. So you might want to try doing things with Michael in different positions. For example, he's in a wheelchair, I know. I don't know if he's different when he's out of the wheelchair. He might be more attentive or less attentive if he's out of the wheelchair, say on his back or on his side. He might be more attentive in the morning than the afternoon. He might be more attentive before a meal or just after a meal. You're really trying to look at all those possibilities, and it is very difficult. And the sad fact is that none of you has the time to devote 7 days a week to observational assessment. You know, you are having to do multiple things, and you yourself are going up and down the ladder, especially down the ladder of arousal, and needing things to lift up your energy back to a more effective level, or sometimes to calm yourself down. If there are times when he seems to get over aroused and stressed or even angry, it's good to explore why is that happening? Is it internal things, or was it something external? And the same if he tends to go down the ladder and get very drowsy, then why might that be? And you made a good point about medication. I had a slide, my very last slide that I didn't quite get to is from another presenter who talked about researching, looking at a list of the medication that a student is on and doing some research online to see what the impact is on a person's functioning of those medications. And she talked about popular medications to control seizures, which can have the effect of creating vertigo in a child, that feeling of disorientation and dizziness. We all know that drugs that are given for seizure disorder tend to push people down the ladder of arousal and make them sleepy and less attentive. And as I said at the beginning of my talk, the question then is, how can you reduce the dosage enough so that the seizures are controlled at an acceptable level, but Michael isn't so drowsy? But that is a difficult one. And those things are usually never stable for very long, because Michael's metabolism is changing as he grows, but for all sorts of other reasons as well. So it is very complicated. I didn't talk very much about motivation today. I did mention it. Finding things that he likes and things that he doesn't like. And I've worked with children who don't really show us anything they like, but they definitely show us things they don't like. And then I say, well, that's where we'll start to get conversations going. We'll do that thing for them to show dislike, and then we'll let them know we're stopping it or we're taking it away, so they can start to learn it was their behavior, it was their response that controlled what we did, so they were being understood. And of course, again, I'm talking very superficially about very complex things, but there's some of the ways that if I were a teacher working with Michael or any other child, they're the kinds of things I would be wanting to look at and share with other people. When I, first meet a child and a family, I have a big list of questions I ask parents and school staff. And you saw my 4 big questions. How do you feel today? Am I seeing you on a good day or a bad day, at a good time or a bad time? And if it's a bad time, why do we think it's a bad time? What kind of things do you like? Do we know that, so I can use those things? What are the things you definitely don't like? And maybe we could use those if we have to. And then what do you do? What kinds of things does Michael do when he's all by himself? Even if they don't look very much, even if they don't look very obvious, even if they don't look very exciting, are there things that give us an idea what's working for him? Is it to do with feeling his fingers? Is it to do with playing with his breathing? Is it to do with lip and tongue and teeth movements? I mean, there are ways of doing things like that. And that I mentioned Chris Russell at the start of this session. He's particularly interested in children who are not particularly responsive, and looking at systems. I mean, sometimes people actually apply electrodes to children in order to get a readout of their current biobehavioral state, and look at minimal things like breathing and muscle tone, eye movements, and mouth movements and tongue movements, those kinds of things. I mean, I've only had an hour, so I've just zoomed over the top of this huge topic. Obviously, I've picked the things I think are really important. And I must say, I've talked about a lot of things that aren't very commonly understood. And I've been trying for 38 years to help people understand these things. 39 years. It's 39 years this summer.
Thank you, David. Thank you very much. This has been wonderful. Two things that just Julie reminded me were 2 minutes from the time. There's 2 links in the chat, one in English and one's for Spanish survey. So please do the evaluations. We will appreciate that. And also a reminder that in a month, June 22nd, we'll be having a sibling panel. So please don't miss that. We're gonna have 3 young women and a male young man be talking and sharing their story. So please register. Remember, each webinar has its own registration, so you can get the link and just keep on learning. If we don't have anything else, Julie, do you want to add?
Yeah, Myrna, if I could jump in, this is Julie. So first of all, thank you so much, David. And I want to make sure to thank our awesome ASL interpreters and Maria, who provided Spanish interpretation, and Connie for our captioning. And David, I mean, you have a lot of fans out there. A lot of people, I think, came here because you were named. But so Angelica, Paul's mom, is saying how great it was.
I see, and Darlene is there as well.
Chris Brown, who had to leave already, but met you at UCSF 10 years ago.
Yes.
His son is getting ready to go to high school with an 8 after 2 years of homeschooling. We remember you well and appreciate your input.
Wow.
Yeah, so Denise Johnson, thank you, David. So super helpful. And yes, of course, David could have filled the whole day. We could have
yes,
gone until 6, but we were sure happy. And then David, wait till you check out what Amanda McKee shared. I'll make sure you get that.
Oh yes, please.
You're gonna love it, Amanda.
It's terrific,
and shows once again the ingenuity and of parents and how well you guys really know your children and know how to explain things to teachers so they understand. So good job.
And don't let any professional tell you you're not smart or your child isn't smart. It simply isn't true. If people say that, they're people who are not competent enough to know what they're doing. And I will send this slideshow to you, Myrna and Julie, straight away.
Thank you, David. Okay. Thank you very much. Okay. Well, it's 6 everyone sharp. Thank you. Thank you. And don't forget the survey.
And we'll see you on June 22nd.
22nd. Thank you, David.
Okay.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you, David.
Thanks, David.
Bye.